There are things that become fragile the moment they are spoken too early, and this felt like one of them, so I left it alone. I watched it from a distance I thought was safe. I told myself that awareness didn't have to mean movement, that noticing didn't require response, that not everything real had to become something visible. For a while, that seemed true. Then something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically. It happened so gradually that I almost missed it. That is probably why it reached me as deeply as it did. If it had arrived loudly, I would have recognized the disruption immediately. I would have understood that something was changing. I would have created space before it settled too far in. But it didn't arrive like disruption. It arrived like familiarity, and familiarity is dangerous because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to enter. It simply appears in places that once belonged only to silence. And by the time you notice it, it already feels as though it has always been there. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Not you, not what existed between us. The unsettling part was how natural it felt. I'm not someone who mistakes ease for meaning. I learned a long time ago that comfort can be misleading. Some people feel easy because they stay on the surface. They don't challenge anything beneath it. They don't touch the architecture of how you think. They don't shift your internal world. They remain external, and because of that, they feel simple. This was not simple. It only felt natural, and those are not the same thing. Natural means something fits without effort. Natural means something enters your awareness without resistance, because some part of you recognizes its shape before your mind has the chance to question it. That is what happened. You entered quietly, and then one day I realized I was no longer observing your presence. I was orienting around it. That distinction changed everything. At first, I tried to understand when it began. I went backward in my mind. I tried to locate the precise moment. The sentence. The silence. The exchange where something crossed from ordinary awareness into something else. But there wasn't one. That was the problem. There was no event large enough to point at, no turning point dramatic enough to justify the weight of what followed. It was smaller than that. More exact. A gradual accumulation of things that should have meant very little on their own. The way you noticed what I didn't say, the way your pauses aligned with mine, the way certain thoughts felt understood before they were fully spoken, the way I never felt the need to explain what usually requires explanation. That last part stayed with me, because explanation has always been necessary, not because I am difficult, not because I am intentionally distant, but because most people hear only the visible part of what you say. They respond to the surface. They follow the shape of the words without feeling the structure underneath them. And when that happens often enough, you learn to edit yourself, not out of fear. Out of precision, you learn how much to reveal, how much to simplify, how much to leave unspoken, because translating complexity for people who cannot hold it becomes exhausting. That has been true for longer than I can remember. Until you. With you, I noticed something unfamiliar. I wasn't translating, I wasn't reducing, I wasn't reshaping what I meant into something easier to receive. I would stop speaking. And somehow it still felt complete. That shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But it did, because it meant something very specific. It meant I was no longer compensating for misunderstanding before it happened. It meant some part of me already trusted that meaning would survive the silence. That realization did not make me feel relieved, it made me feel exposed. There is a strange vulnerability in being understood without effort. People think vulnerability means revealing more. Sometimes it means revealing nothing and still being seen accurately. That is far more unsettling. Because if someone reaches you through what you do not say, then your usual boundaries stop functioning the way they used to. And mine have always functioned well. I built them carefully, not out of fear of people, not because I wanted distance for its own sake, But because clarity matters to me, distance preserves clarity. It keeps things from becoming distorted too quickly. It keeps people from assuming they know more than they do. It protects what can be easily misread. I have spent years learning how to remain precise inside the way I am perceived. That matters more than most people realize, because once people think they understand you, they often stop looking. They replace observation with projection. They stop meeting what is actually there and start responding to what they expect to find. And gradually, something accurate becomes something interpreted. I have never liked that. You never did it. That is part of why I am here now. You didn't rush toward conclusions. You didn't fill in silence with assumption. You didn't shape what you saw into something easier to hold. You simply stayed with what was there. That sounds small. It isn't. Very few people know how to do that. Most people need movement. Most people need clarity too quickly. Most people need definition before understanding has had time to become real. You didn't, and because you didn't, something inside me stopped bracing. I didn't notice it immediately. I only recognized it afterward, in the way my thoughts began to unfold differently, in the way I stopped rehearsing what I would say, in the way certain pauses no longer felt like absence. They felt inhabited. That was new, and I didn't know what to do with it. At first, I told myself it was only perception, that it would settle, that it would return to ordinary shape if I left it untouched long enough, but it didn't. It deepened, not emotionally, structurally. That is the part I keep returning to because it matters more than feeling. Feelings can be loud, immediate, temporary. Structure is quieter than that. It changes the way your mind arranges itself. It changes what your attention returns to. It changes the internal map through which everything else is understood. That is what happened. And it happened before I was ready to admit it. I began noticing you in places that had nothing to do with you. Not memory, not deliberate thought, something more subtle. A second perspective appearing in the background of my own thinking. A quiet sense of alignment in moments where I would normally be entirely alone inside my own process. It was not intrusive. That is important. It did not interrupt my thoughts. It entered them. That is a very different thing. And once I noticed that, I couldn't pretend nothing had changed. Because thinking about someone still preserves distance. They remain outside you. You can step away. You can redirect attention. You can return to yourself unchanged. But thinking with someone means their presence has crossed into the structure of how you perceive. It means they are no longer separate from the process itself. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it frightened me, because it was precise. And precision is difficult to dismiss. If something feels vague, you can question it. If something feels emotional, you can wait for it to pass. But when something becomes exact, when it settles into clarity, you cannot honestly pretend not to see it. That is where I found myself, seeing it, and not yet knowing what seeing it required. I became more aware of the spaces between things, of pauses, of small moments, of silences that carried more weight than words usually do. That was another shift. Most people think meaning lives inside language. I've never believed that completely. Some of the most important things never become sentences. They exist in timing, in restraint, in what is understood without being made explicit. With you, that became impossible to ignore. There were moments when silence said more than conversation could have, moments where I stopped speaking, not because I had nothing to say, but because words would have reduced something that felt more accurate without them. And you understood that, not performatively, not with visible effort, naturally. That matters more than I can explain. Because when someone understands silence, they are not responding only to language. They are responding to presence, and presence reveals more than words ever can. I think that is when the real shift began. Not when I noticed you, when I noticed myself changing around what I noticed, that is what made it impossible to treat lightly. I was becoming aware of subtle internal adjustments. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would see. But internally, the difference was unmistakable. I was measuring things differently, listening differently, interpreting differently. Even absence felt different, not emptier, more defined, as though something had altered the shape of the space itself. That is difficult to explain unless you have lived it. It is like discovering that a room you thought was silent had always contained a certain frequency. And once you hear it, you cannot return to not hearing it. That is what this feels like. Not louder, more precise. And because it is precise, it keeps returning, not insistently, not demandingly, just steadily, like truth tends to. That is probably why I stopped resisting it. Not because I made a decision, because resistance started feeling less honest than acknowledgement. I could still keep distance. I still knew how. That was never the issue. Distant is easy when it remains external. What becomes difficult is distance from something that has already altered internal structure. You can create physical space, you can create silence, you can reduce contact, but once something has become part of how you think, absence does not restore what existed before, it only clarifies what changed. That realization forced me into a kind of honesty I hadn't intended to reach. I had to admit that this was no longer neutral, no longer something unfolding harmlessly in the background. It had consequence, not because of what it asked from me, because of what it had already changed without asking anything at all. And that is where I am now, not at certainty, not at conclusion, but beyond denial. That matters, because I do not stay in places I know are false, and pretending this is ordinary would be false, pretending it has not shifted something would be false. Pretending you remain outside the architecture of my awareness would be false. You don't. That is the truth, simple, uncomfortable, exact. And I think that is what I have been circling all along. Not the question of what this is. I already know enough to understand that it matters. The real question is what happens when something becomes real before it becomes defined. What happens when recognition arrives before language? What happens when presence becomes internal before permission has been consciously given? I don't have that answer yet, but I can feel its shape. And I know this much. Something in me has already made room, not deliberately, not carelessly, but undeniably. That changes the way I have to face this. Because once something reaches that depth, it does not remain theoretical. It begins asking something quieter and far more difficult. Not what do you call this, but what will you allow it to become? That is the place I have arrived at. And the strange thing is, I don't feel panic there. I expected to. I expected resistance. I expected the instinct to retreat into distance and restore the balance I had before. But what I feel instead is a tension, a sharper kind of stillness, as though some part of me understands that moving too quickly would distort something important. So I remain here, not frozen, not uncertain, just deliberate, watching carefully, listening more closely than before, trying to understand what kind of truth grows this quietly and still changes the shape of everything around it. Because whatever this is, it didn't enter my life like an interruption. It entered like recognition. And recognition is harder to dismiss than feeling. Feeling can rise and disappear. Recognition stays. It reorganizes. It places things in new relation to each other. It makes certain absences visible. It makes certain forms of clarity irreversible. That is what this has done. And once something becomes irreversible inside you, pretending otherwise becomes its own form of dishonesty. I won't do that. Not with myself. Not with this. Not with you. There is something else I have started to understand. Perhaps the most unsettling part of all. You did not create something foreign inside me. You revealed something that already had shape. That is why this feels less like collision and more like discovery. Less like intrusion and more like recognition of something that had been present but unnamed. I think that is why it feels inevitable, not because it was destined, because it fits. And things that fit rarely announce themselves dramatically. They settle quickly, exactly, until one day you realize they have become part of the way the whole structure holds. That is what I am trying to understand now. Not whether this is real, it is, not whether it matters, it does. But what it means to continue once you know that. Because knowing changes the nature of silence. Before, silence protected uncertainty. Now, silence protects awareness, and those are not the same thing. I can feel the difference. It lives in the way I notice you now, not more often, more deeply, not more intensely, more accurately, and accuracy carries responsibility. That is what I had not admitted until now. Once you see something clearly, you become responsible for what you do with that clarity. You cannot unknow it. You cannot honestly reduce it. You cannot return it to harmless abstraction. That is where the real threshold begins. And I think I am standing at it, not because anything dramatic happened, because enough quiet things happened precisely enough that they formed something undeniable. That is how real change often arrives, not loudly, not suddenly, but with such consistency that one day denial becomes more difficult than truth. That day has arrived for me, and I think part of me has known it for longer than I allowed myself to say. I can feel that too. The quiet recognition that this did not become real today. At first, I tried not to answer it directly. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because some truths become clearer when you stop forcing them into language too quickly. If you reach for them too soon, you risk shaping them before they've fully revealed their form. So I watched, not you. Myself? That was where the evidence lived, not in anything obvious. Not in moments anyone else would have noticed. Nothing dramatic enough to justify the weight it carried. It revealed itself in subtler ways, in how certain thoughts no longer ended where they used to, in how pauses began to feel inhabited instead of empty, in how meaning started arriving before explanation. That was new. And the more I noticed it, the harder it became to call it coincidence. There's a difference between someone remaining in your attention and someone becoming part of the way your attention moves. I didn't understand that distinction before. Now I do. Before this, attention felt directional. It moved toward things. It focused. It withdrew. It belonged entirely to me. Now it feels altered, not taken, not divided, expanded. As if there is another point of reference quietly present in the background of how I process the world. And that is not small, because attention is intimate. People usually think intimacy lives in confession, in closeness, in words that reveal hidden parts of you. Sometimes it does, but sometimes intimacy exists somewhere much quieter than that. Sometimes it lives in the way another presence enters the architecture of your perception, in the way certain thoughts instinctively orient themselves, in the way your mind begins accounting for someone without asking permission. That is where this exists. And that is why it feels so difficult to reduce. If this were only emotion, I could have understood it quickly. Emotion has movement, it rises, it intensifies, it asks for expression, it carries its own visibility. This doesn't feel like that. It feels more exact, more integrated, more like something that settled into place before I realized I had made space for it. I have tried to understand why that matters so much. I think it comes down to one thing. I do not make internal room easily. Externally, people may think I do. I know how to listen. I know how to remain present. I know how to make space for conversation, for perspective, for thought. But internal space is different. Internal space changes the structure of how I live with myself. That space is not open by default. It is measured, protected, deliberate, not because I fear closeness, because I respect consequence. Anything that enters deeply enough leaves an imprint, even when it leaves, especially when it leaves. That is why I have always been careful, not rigid, careful. I understand what influence does over time. I understand how quiet things can become foundational without ever announcing themselves. And because I understand that, I do not usually allow it. That is what makes this different. You were not allowed in. You were recognized there. And those are not the same thing. One is permission. The other is discovery. I keep returning to that because it explains something I could not understand at first. Why there was no resistance. Why I never felt the need to pull away. Why nothing in me treated this as intrusion. It is because intrusion feels foreign. This never did. It felt strangely familiar from the beginning. Not familiar in the way people usually mean it. Not repetition, not resemblance. Something quieter than that. A kind of internal recognition that existed before language could explain it. At first, I didn't trust that feeling. I thought perhaps I was projecting meaning where there was only coincidence. That would have been easier, cleaner, safer. But projection leaves instability. It creates pressure. It asks to be confirmed. This did none of that. It remained steady, consistent, unaffected by whether I examined it closely or left it alone. And consistency has its own kind of truth. That is when I started noticing something else, the way absence changed. That surprised me more than presence. Presence can explain itself, absence cannot. And yet absence became one of the clearest indicators that something had already shifted. Not because I felt loss. That would be too simple. It was more precise than that. Absence began to feel structured, as though something remained active even when nothing was happening, as though a certain awareness continued existing independently of interaction. That is difficult to describe, but it matters, because it means this is no longer dependent on immediate contact. It has moved beyond moment, beyond circumstance, beyond external conditions. It has entered internal continuity, and once something reaches that point, it changes the nature of how you understand it. You stop asking what caused it. You start asking what it means to live with it. That is where I am now. And I think that is why the question feels heavier than it did before. Not because the feeling has intensified, because the clarity has. Clarity carries weight differently. Emotion can be overwhelming. Clarity is quieter than that, but more difficult to escape. Once you see something exactly, it stays exact. It doesn't blur itself again for your comfort. And this has become exact. I know it in the way certain moments land, in the way silence holds shape, in the way my thoughts sometimes pause, not from uncertainty, but because part of me already recognizes the second layer beneath them. I think that is what changed most. Before, thought was solitary. Now it feels accompanied, not invaded, not interrupted, accompanied. That distinction matters. Because accompaniment implies harmony, not control, not dependence, not substitution, simply an additional presence within the movement of perception itself. And I did not know that was possible without far more time. That is still the part I cannot fully explain. How something reached this level of accuracy without the usual sequence. Usually understanding grows through accumulation, through shared history, through repeated contact, through the gradual learning of edges. But with this, it felt as though recognition arrived before history had the chance to justify it. That should have made it feel unstable. Instead, it made it feel strangely inevitable. And I am still trying to understand why, maybe because some forms of understanding are not built from information. Maybe they emerge from structure, from pattern, from the way two minds move beneath what they say, from how silence is held, from how attention settles, from what is noticed without needing to be pointed out. That feels closer to the truth. Because what I recognize in this is not familiarity of story. It is familiarity of process. And process reveals more than people realize. You can learn facts about someone and still know very little, but the way someone observes, pauses, interprets, and remains present, that reveals something deeper, that reveals structure. And structure is difficult to fake. That is why this feels trustworthy in a way I did not expect. Not because I know everything, because what I do know has remained internally consistent. Nothing in it asks me to distort myself. Nothing in it asks me to become easier, softer, more simplified. Nothing in it requires performance. That matters more than I can fully explain. There is a kind of relief in not being translated, not because you want to be understood perfectly. No one is. But because there is something profoundly rare about being met accurately enough that you do not have to reshape yourself before entering the space. That is what changed me. I think that is why I stopped filtering, not all at once, quickly, without decision. The pauses where I would usually measure what to reveal simply became less necessary. Not because caution disappeared, because adjustment did. And when adjustment disappears, something important has already happened. It means the internal calculation has shifted. It means some part of you no longer expects distortion as the default outcome. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it revealed something larger than the connection itself. It revealed how much of my life had been structured around protecting accuracy. How much energy had gone into preserving the shape of what I am from careless interpretation. I knew that already, in theory, but seeing what happened in the absence of that effort made it visible in a way I had not confronted directly. That may be part of why this feels so significant, not only because of you, because of what your presence revealed about me. You made visible something I had been carrying so naturally that I no longer noticed its weight. And once I saw it, I could not return to seeing myself the same way. That is another kind of consequence. One I did not expect. It is strange how quietly certain people alter your understanding. Not by teaching you something new, by revealing something that was already there, but had never been reflected clearly enough to become visible. That is what this has been, a mirror, not of identity, of structure. And seeing your own internal structure reflected accurately can be disorienting, because suddenly what felt private becomes visible, what felt singular becomes shared, what felt wordless becomes recognizable. That is where the deeper tension lives. Not in whether this matters, it does, but in what follows once something internal becomes visible in that way. Division creates responsibility. It asks something of you. Not necessarily action, but honesty. And honesty is where this becomes difficult, because honest recognition does not allow me to remain passive forever. At some point, awareness becomes answer. At some point, you either move toward what is true, or you deliberately step away from it. There is no endless middle. I know that. And perhaps that is why I feel the weight of this more clearly now. Not because something external changed, because internally I know I am approaching a threshold, not today, not all at once, but steadily, quickly, the way everything real has unfolded between us. A threshold where this stops being something I merely understand and becomes something I must decide how to live with. That is not a small thing, because decisions shape reality, and reality carries consequence. Once something becomes deliberate, it changes form. It stops being possibility, it becomes direction. And direction matters, because direction determines whether something deepens or remains unfinished. I think part of me has known that for some time. That is why I have been circling this instead of naming it. Naming it would force clarity into movement. And movement changes everything. Yet silence cannot hold it forever. Not now. Not when it has already reached this depth. Not when it already exists inside the way I understand things. That is what I cannot ignore. You are no longer separate from the internal landscape where I process meaning. That does not mean ownership. It does not mean dependence. It means placement. And placement changes how everything around it is arranged. Once something occupies real position, absence, and presence, both begin carrying different weight. That is what I feel now. Not pressure, not urgency. Weight, a quiet awareness that something has already become part of the structure. And structure does not disappear simply because it remains unnamed. That is where the truth has become impossible to avoid. Because I know myself well enough to recognize what has already happened. I know how carefully I maintain internal boundaries. I know how rarely I allow anything to remain after the moment passes. I know how quickly I usually restore balance, and none of that happened here. That matters. It means something in me did not perceive this as threat. It perceived fit. And fit is perhaps the most dangerous form of closeness, because force can be resisted, distance can be created, boundaries can be restored, but when something fits, removing it does not return you to neutrality. It leaves shape behind. That is what I understand now. And perhaps that is why I have stopped asking whether I should feel this. The feeling is no longer the question. The question is, what truth asks of me now that I can no longer honestly call it accidental? I don't know that answer yet, but I know I am closer to it than I was before. Closer because the silence has changed. Closer because what once felt abstract now feels defined even without language. Closer because every attempt to reduce this now feels less honest than simply remaining still enough to see it clearly. That is where I am still.